When James Garner finally decided to speak openly about Randolph Scott, it wasn't part of a scripted interview or a carefully prepared memoir. It was quiet, raw, and honest, the kind of confession that only comes from a man who has carried truths for decades. For years, Hollywood had whispered about the deep bond between the two Western icons. Their connection was mysterious, their friendship unwavering, and their respect for one another almost legendary. But few ever knew what really went on behind the scenes, until Garner finally told the truth. James Garner's story didn't begin with fame or red carpets. He was born James Scott Bumgarner on April 7, 1928, in Norman, Oklahoma, a small town where life was hard and survival depended on grit. His childhood was far from glamorous. His mother died when he was only 5 years old, leaving him and his brothers in the care of a father who struggled to provide. The Great Depression cast a long shadow over his early years. Money was tight, and dreams were often replaced by long hours of work and responsibility. But through those difficult years, Garner developed the kind of quiet strength that would later define every role he played, the calm hero who didn't need to shout to command attention. He learned early how to handle pain, how to endure, and how to keep going when things got tough. Those who knew him as a boy remembered him as polite but firm, gentle but unyielding. It was that rare mix of decency and steel that made him stand out, even before Hollywood took notice. But long before he ever faced a camera, Garner faced something far more dangerous. At 16, restless and eager to see the world, he dropped out of school and joined the Merchant Marines during World War II. Later, he would serve in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, where he was wounded in action twice. He carried those scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of his life. The war didn't make him proud, it made him humble. It stripped away illusions about glory and fame and taught him what really mattered: loyalty, courage, and truth. Those same qualities would one day draw him to Randolph Scott, a man who, like Garner, lived by a quiet code of honor. But in the 1950s, that meeting was still years away. When Garner returned from the war, he didn't have a plan. Hollywood wasn't even a dream. He drifted from job to job, modeling for catalogs, working on construction sites, even selling carpets, until one day fate stepped in. A friend working as an extra on a Broadway play invited him to help out backstage. It was there that a casting director noticed him, tall, handsome, with an easy confidence that didn't need to be forced. Garner didn't even know how to act, but the camera didn't seem to care. He had that rare natural charisma, the kind you can't teach. Soon, television discovered him. In 1957, he was cast as Brett Maverick in the hit series Maverick, a Western unlike any other. Maverick wasn't the typical cowboy. He was witty, reluctant to fight, and clever enough to win most battles with his mind rather than his gun. The character was a reflection of Garner himself, charming, kind, and disarmingly honest. Overnight, he became a household name. The audience loved him because he felt real, a man with humor, integrity, and just enough vulnerability to make him human. But as Garner's fame skyrocketed, he found himself entering a Hollywood that was still deeply traditional, ruled by studio contracts and larger-than-life movie stars. Among those legends stood Randolph Scott, tall, stoic, and known as one of the silver screen's most dependable Western heroes. Scott had already been a major star for decades when Garner arrived. By the time the younger actor became famous, Scott was nearing the end of his career. Yet something about Garner reminded people of a young Scott. The same calm authority, the same subtle humor, the same sense of morality that ran beneath every performance. The first time they met was at a charity event in Los Angeles. Garner later described it as unforgettable. He was the kind of man who didn't have to say much, Garner recalled. He'd walk into a room and you'd just know he was someone to respect. The two hit it off immediately, drawn together by a mutual love of the Western genre and an unspoken understanding of what it meant to play a man of honor in an industry built on illusion. But there was more to their connection than just professional respect. Both men shared a distaste for Hollywood's hypocrisy. Scott, despite his fame, was intensely private. He had spent years avoiding the spotlight whenever possible, preferring to retreat to his elegant Santa Monica home where he lived quietly with his longtime companion. Garner, too, wasn't one for Hollywood parties or gossip columns. He was known to show up on set, do his job with excellence, and disappear before the after-party began. Yet that quiet integrity also made them targets. Hollywood loved to gossip about what it couldn't understand. Randolph Scott's private life had long been the subject of rumor. He was famously close to fellow actor Cary Grant, with whom he shared a home for several years, a friendship that the tabloids twisted into something scandalous for the time. Garner, aware of the industry's tendency to invent stories, found himself both fascinated and protective of Scott. Behind closed doors, he saw a man who didn't fit the Hollywood mold, not because he was hiding something shameful, but because he lived on his own terms. When Garner began working more closely with Western legends like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, he often mentioned Scott as a quiet influence, a reminder that a true cowboy didn't have to be loud or cruel to be strong. Scott, he said, had a dignity that was disappearing in the industry. Randolph Scott was the kind of man every other actor wished he could be, Garner admitted years later. But even as he praised him, he kept one story hidden, one that spoke to the depth of their bond and the moment that changed how Garner saw Hollywood forever. It happened during the filming of a Western that both men were loosely connected to, though they never officially shared the screen. Garner had been struggling with studio executives who wanted him to compromise his character for publicity, something he refused to do. Word of the dispute reached Scott, who, despite being semi-retired, called the studio head personally. He didn't owe Garner anything, yet he stood up for him anyway. "Jimmy's the real deal," Scott told them. "You don't push a man like that. You work with him." The issue disappeared overnight. For Garner, it was a defining moment. In a town where loyalty was rare, Scott had gone out of his way to defend him. No cameras, no headlines, just one man standing up for another. From that day forward, Garner considered Randolph Scott not just a mentor, but a friend unlike any other. Still, for decades, he kept the story to himself. The Hollywood system had a way of punishing sincerity, and Garner had learned to protect what mattered most, the truth. What was that truth? That behind the calm smiles and Western hero personas, both men carried a shared loneliness, the kind that comes from living in a world that never quite understands who you really are. And in that silent understanding, a deep private respect was born, one that Garner would never forget. When he finally broke his silence years later, after Scott had long passed, he did so with the same honesty that had defined his entire life. "Randolph Scott," he said quietly, "wasn't just a great actor. He was a great man." And Hollywood never really knew the half of it. The story didn't end there. Because what Garner revealed next, the truth about Scott's hidden pain, his secret generosity, and the one decision that changed both their lives, would leave Hollywood speechless. When James Garner finally began speaking openly about Randolph Scott's true nature, he did so with a tone that mixed reverence and regret. Reverence for the man he admired, and regret for how misunderstood he had been. For years, the Hollywood rumor mill had twisted Scott's private life into whispers and half-truths. But Garner, who had known the man behind the legend, knew a very different Randolph Scott, one whose kindness, discipline, and quiet strength had shaped an entire generation of Western stars, including himself. Randolph Scott's story was one of paradoxes. To the public, he was the epitome of the strong, silent cowboy, a man who looked perfectly at home riding through the desert, his face carved from stone and his eyes reflecting 1,000 miles of solitude. But away from the camera, Scott was surprisingly gentle, introspective, and soft-spoken. He didn't care for fame, and he never played the Hollywood game. He avoided scandals, refused to give interviews about his personal life, and often disappeared between films. While others sought attention, Scott sought peace. Garner would often recall the way Scott carried himself, graceful, calm, but always alert. "He didn't need to prove who he was," Garner once said. "You could tell by the way he treated people." That was something Garner admired deeply. because he had seen the other side of Hollywood. The arrogance, the betrayal, the constant competition for power and recognition. Scott was different. He helped young actors quietly, offering advice or pulling strings behind the scenes, but he never asked for credit. Randolph Scott didn't help people because he wanted to be seen as a hero, Garner said. He helped because it was the right thing to do. But Scott also carried his own pain, a loneliness that Garner recognized all too well. Behind the glamorous photos of Scott's sprawling Los Angeles mansion, there was a man who preferred isolation to the noise of fame. After years of working under the studio system, Scott had grown tired of being molded and marketed. He turned down roles that didn't feel true to him, even when it meant losing millions. He invested his fortune wisely, building a life of quiet comfort. But despite all that success, there was always a shadow, a sense that something had been left unresolved. Garner once hinted that Scott's heart had been broken early in life. Whether it was lost love, the crushing demands of Hollywood, or simply the price of fame, he never said. What he did say was this: he was a man who gave everything to the screen, and in return, it took a piece of him. Garner saw in Scott the same emotional exhaustion that he would later feel himself after years of battling studios and critics. Both men shared the same belief that acting was a job, not an ego trip. That humility made them outsiders in an industry built on pretense. When Garner first rose to fame with Maverick and later The Rockford Files, Scott had already retired from acting. But their paths often crossed at events, private gatherings, and charity fundraisers. Scott, older and more experienced, became something of a silent mentor. He admired Garner's naturalism, the way he could make even a line of humor sound honest. Garner, in turn, admired Scott's integrity, his refusal to compromise. The two would often talk about how Hollywood was changing, and not always for the better. "He told me once," Garner said, "Jimmy, if you ever have to choose between being famous and being happy, choose happy. Fame fades fast, but peace lasts a lifetime." That advice would stay with Garner for the rest of his life. When he later found himself in conflict with studios who wanted to overwork or underpay him, he remembered Scott's example: to stand tall, to walk away, rather than be disrespected. And that's exactly what he did. Garner even took legal action against a major network that had refused to pay him fairly, and he won, not just for himself, but for every actor who came after him. "I learned that from Randy," he said. "He never backed down from doing what was right." But there was another truth Garner revealed that stunned many who thought they knew Randolph Scott. Beneath the rugged cowboy image, Scott had a deep compassion for those who struggled. Few people knew it, but he quietly supported several charities, including veterans programs and orphanages. He never wanted the public to know. He said once, "If you need applause for doing good, then you're not really doing good," Garner shared. In that one sentence, he summed up the man perfectly. Garner also opened up about the emotional distance that had existed between Scott and the world. The two often talked about loneliness, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from never being truly understood. "We were both private men," Garner admitted. "We didn't fit into the Hollywood crowd. Maybe that's why we understood each other without saying much." There was one particular meeting between them that Garner never forgot. It was in the early 1980s, years after Scott had left the spotlight. They met for lunch at a quiet restaurant near Santa Monica. Scott was older, slower, but still carried himself with dignity. They talked about life, old friends, and the state of Hollywood, how it had changed beyond recognition. As the meal ended, Scott placed his hand on Garner's arm and said, "You've done it right. Jimmy, you kept your soul intact." Garner said that moment meant more to him than any award he ever received. Randolph Scott passed away in 1987 at the age of 89. Hollywood mourned him, but for James Garner, the loss was deeply personal. "He wasn't just a movie star," Garner said. "He was one of the last true gentlemen." After Scott's death, Garner avoided interviews about him for years. He didn't want to feed the gossip or sensationalize a man who had lived so quietly. But as he grew older, he began to feel that silence wasn't fair either. Too many people had misunderstood Scott's legacy, reducing him to rumors or romanticizing him as something he wasn't. He was human, Garner said. He made mistakes, but he never lied about who he was. That's rare. The truth that Garner finally shared wasn't scandalous. It wasn't a confession of secrets or hidden lives. It was something far more powerful. A reminder that even in a world built on illusion, there are still men who live with integrity. Randolph Scott was one of them. And for Garner, the lesson he left behind was simple, that real strength isn't about toughness, but about kindness. Not about fame, but about authenticity. In his later years, Garner would reflect often on the people who shaped him. He had worked with legends, Steve McQueen, Marlon Brando, Clint Eastwood. But when asked who influenced him most, he always came back to Randolph Scott. He showed me that being a man isn't about what you show the world, Garner said. It's about what you protect inside yourself. Even as he aged and his health declined, Garner carried those lessons with him. When he appeared in The Notebook in 2004, audiences saw that same gentle dignity, a kind of emotional truth that was rare in modern film. Many fans later said that his performance in that movie felt different, more personal, and maybe that's because it was. He had lived it. The love, the loss, the quiet endurance, all of it was real. All of it was drawn from a lifetime of experience. From men like Randolph Scott who had taught him what true courage looked like.